Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered dock of Heron Bay Marina as Michael Reeves secured the last of his gear in the small cooler. At 31, with a lean build earned from years of navigating the waters of the Florida Keys, Michael had developed an intimate relationship with the sea. He checked his watch, 5:45 a.m., perfect timing to catch the early bite at Conch Reef. The forecast promised calm waters and moderate winds, ideal conditions for a solo fishing trip. "Heading out early, Mike?" called Jerry, the aging dockmaster, who seemed perpetually stationed at his post, regardless of the hour. Michael nodded, adjusting his faded blue cap emblazoned with the logo of the charter company, where he occasionally worked as a guide. "Just for the day. Should be back before sunset. Weather's holding up, but they're saying a front might push through later," Jerry warned, squinting at the horizon where thin clouds stretched like pulled cotton. "Don't stray too far." "Never do," Michael replied, with the casual confidence of someone who considered these waters a second home. His 17-foot Boston whaler wasn't the newest vessel in the marina, but Michael had maintained it meticulously since purchasing it 3 years ago. The 90-horsepower outboard motor had been recently serviced, and he'd installed a new fish finder last month, an extravagance he justified by the improved catches it had already delivered. As he untied the mooring lines, Michael mentally reviewed his route. Conch Reef was about 12 miles southeast, a 45-minute journey that would put him at his favorite fishing spot, just as the sun fully breached the horizon, the golden hour when yellowtail snapper and grouper were most active. The engine rumbled to life with a reassuring purr. Michael eased the throttle forward, navigating slowly through the no-wake zone until he cleared the channel markers. Once in open water, he pushed the throttle ahead, lifting the bow as the boat planed across the glassy surface. The cool morning air rushed past his face, carrying the distinctive briny scent of the Atlantic. These were the moments he lived for, the solitude, the freedom, the intimate connection with the ocean that had drawn him to the Keys 5 years ago after leaving his accounting job in Tampa. Sandbar Key, a small island with a historic lighthouse, came into view to his starboard side. Michael adjusted his course, keeping the landmark in sight as he followed his usual route. The water around him shifted from the murky green of the bay to a crystalline azure that revealed sandy patches and seagrass beds below. Schools of ballyhoo skipped across the surface, scattering at the boat's approach, a good sign that predator fish might be in the area. He reduced speed as he approached his destination, where the reef system created a natural haven for the species he targeted. Switching off the engine, Michael deployed his anchor, ensuring it caught firmly on the sandy bottom rather than damaging the protected coral. He checked his GPS, right on the spot where he'd had luck last week. The next few hours passed in the meditative rhythm familiar to any dedicated angler. Michael caught several respectable yellowtail snapper and a decent-sized black grouper, keeping only what he needed for himself and his neighbor Sarah, a retired schoolteacher, who often traded her homemade key lime pie for fresh fillets. The sun climbed higher, its intensity amplified by reflection off the water. By mid-morning, sweat trickled down his back despite the cooling ocean breeze. Around 11, the wind began to shift, bringing with it the distant rumble of thunder. Michael glanced at the western horizon, where dark clouds had begun to gather more rapidly than the morning forecast had suggested. Jerry's warning echoed in his mind. Deciding not to push his luck, he secured his catch in the cooler, stowed his gear, and pulled up the anchor. The return journey began smoothly enough, but within 15 minutes the skies darkened considerably. The previously gentle swells grew choppy, slapping against the hull of his boat with increasing force. Michael reduced his speed, navigating more cautiously as visibility diminished. Radio chatter indicated that the storm system was moving faster than predicted, with small craft advisories being issued for the area. 20 minutes from the marina, a sharp crack followed by a stuttering sound from the outboard caused Michael's stomach to tighten with apprehension. The engine coughed, surged briefly, then died completely. He tried restarting it several times, each attempt yielding the same result, a momentary turnover, followed by silence. "Damn it," he muttered, reaching for his toolbox. Rain had begun to fall, light at first but quickly intensifying into a steady downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Michael huddled under the center console's minimal shelter, checking the fuel lines and electrical connections with increasingly wet hands. Nothing seemed obviously wrong, which only heightened his concern. He reached for his marine radio. "This is vessel Line Dancer, requesting assistance, approximately 3 miles southeast of Heron Bay Marina. Engine failure, single occupant aboard." The Coast Guard responded promptly, but the news wasn't encouraging. "Line Dancer, this is Coast Guard Station Key Largo. We're currently responding to multiple distress calls due to the storm, dispatching vessels as available. What's your current situation?" "Stable but drifting," Michael replied, eyeing the increasingly turbulent water around him. "Engine won't restart. No immediate danger, but conditions are deteriorating." "Understood, Line Dancer. Maintain radio contact. Estimate assistance within 1 to 2 hours. Do you have proper safety equipment aboard?" "Affirmative. Life jacket. On flares accessible." Michael didn't mention that his emergency position indicating radio beacon was in for repair, an oversight he now deeply regretted. As the conversation ended, Michael assessed his options. The current was pushing him southeast, away from the marina and toward more open water. Without power, he couldn't fight it. The strengthening storm made paddling with his single emergency oar a futile exercise against the building waves. The map of the area was etched in his memory after countless trips. If he continued drifting on this trajectory, he would eventually approach Coral Key, a small uninhabited island about 4 miles from his current position. The key had a small beach on its northwestern side where he could potentially land the boat safely, assuming the wind and current didn't change dramatically. Lightning flashed, followed seconds later by a boom of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the fiberglass hull. The rain fell in sheets now, reducing visibility further. Michael pulled his rain jacket tighter, securing the hood as he considered his predicament. He knew from experience that storms in this region could intensify quickly, but typically passed through just as rapidly. After 40 uncomfortable minutes of drifting, the rain began to slacken, though the sky remained ominously dark. Through a break in the downpour, Michael spotted the outline of Coral Key, now perhaps 2 miles distant. The boat had been pushed south of his anticipated drift path, meaning he would miss the island entirely unless he took action. The decision crystallized in his mind. Swim to the key. Under normal circumstances, it would be an ill-advised choice, but with rescue potentially hours away and the threat of being pushed into the deeper Atlantic waters, it seemed the most viable option. Michael was a strong swimmer. He'd competed collegiately and still maintained good condition with regular ocean swims. He quickly assembled what he needed: his waterproof phone case, a small dry bag containing his ID and marina pass, a water bottle, and a diving knife he always kept aboard. After donning his life jacket and securing the items, he took a deep breath, broadcast his position and intentions on the radio, and slipped over the side of the boat. The water was warmer than the rain-cooled air, but the choppy surface made establishing a rhythm difficult. Michael adopted a modified breaststroke, keeping his head above water to maintain sight of the key. The distance seemed manageable. He'd swum farther during training, but the unpredictable swells and the weight of his clothes made progress slower than anticipated. 20 minutes into the swim, Michael paused to rest, treading water as he gauged his position. The key seemed closer now, perhaps a mile away. His arms felt the familiar burn of exertion, but his breathing remained controlled. He took a sip from his water bottle before continuing, settling back into his stroke pattern. The next half hour passed in a grueling rhythm of effort, punctuated by brief rests. The island grew larger in his field of vision, providing motivation as fatigue began to creep into his muscles. The water around him had changed color, shifting from the deeper blue of the channel to a lighter turquoise that indicated shallower depths near the island's surrounding reef system. It was during one of his rest periods, approximately 400 yards from the key's shoreline, that Michael first sensed something had changed. An instinctive wariness prickled at his consciousness, the feeling of being watched that humans have evolved over millennia as a survival mechanism. He scanned the water around him, seeing nothing but the gentle undulation of waves. Then he spotted it, a triangular fin cutting through the surface about 50 yards away, moving in a deliberate path that would intersect with his own. The fin disappeared, then resurfaced closer, confirming his worst fear: a shark, and a large one, from the size of the dorsal fin. Michael's heart rate spiked as primal fear flooded his system. His knowledge of shark behavior, accumulated through years of fishing these waters and mandatory training as a charter guide, snapped into focus through the haze of adrenaline. He identified his options with sudden clarity: swim frantically for shore, potentially triggering a predatory response, or maintain composure, move deliberately and try to present himself as neither prey nor threat. He chose the latter approach, continuing toward the island with measured strokes, fighting the urge to thrash or accelerate. The shark circled wider, now its pattern suggesting assessment rather than immediate aggression, a behavior Michael recognized as typical of bull sharks, one of the species most commonly encountered in these waters. The distance to shore had never seemed so vast. Each stroke carried him closer to safety, but the shark maintained its presence, sometimes disappearing from view only to re-emerge at a different angle. Michael kept his movements steady, trying to project the demeanor of a creature that belonged. In this environment, rather than a panicked interloper, when he was approximately 200 yards from shore, the shark's behavior changed. Its circling tightened, and its movements became more direct. Michael knew these were warning signs, precursors to a potential investigative approach, or worse, an attack. He reached for the diving knife strapped to his calf, drawing it slowly, without making sudden movements. The shark, definitely a bull shark he could now see at least 8 feet in length, made a close pass, less than 10 feet away. Michael could distinguish its gray-brown coloration and the characteristic blunt snout that gave the species its name. The animal's cold black eye seemed to evaluate him with ancient, impassive intelligence. "Easy," Michael whispered, as much to calm himself as to address the predator. He maintained his course toward shore, knife held low at his side, ready but not threatening. The next moments unfolded with a surreal clarity that would later haunt his dreams. The shark disappeared from view, and in the momentary reprieve, Michael increased his pace slightly. Then, without warning, he felt a tremendous force strike his right leg from below. Teeth clamped around his calf with crushing pressure, tearing through wetsuit, skin, and muscle in an instant of blinding pain. Water churned around him as the shark shook its head, the motion magnifying the damage to Michael's leg. Training and instinct converged in his response. He drove the diving knife downward, striking the shark's snout near its eye. The sensitive area, packed with electroreceptors, registered the pain immediately. The shark released its grip and veered away, leaving a cloud of blood blooming in the water. Michael gasped, the pain momentarily overwhelming his senses. He fought to remain conscious, knowing that blood loss and shock posed as much danger as a second attack. The life jacket kept him afloat as he assessed the damage. His wetsuit leg was shredded, revealing a gaping wound that pulsed with each heartbeat. The water around him turned crimson at an alarming rate. The shore lay tantalizingly close, perhaps 150 yards now. Michael knew he had minutes, not hours, before blood loss would render him incapable of reaching it. Using his uninjured leg and arms, he propelled himself forward with desperate efficiency, no longer concerned with appearing non-threatening. The shark had withdrawn after the strike with the knife, but bull sharks were known for their persistence. The blood in the water virtually guaranteed its return, possibly with others. Each yard toward shore was a victory against increasing lightheadedness. Michael focused on a single palm tree at the edge of the beach, using it as his target. When his good foot finally touched the sandy bottom, relief surged through him. He half swam, half dragged himself through the shallows until he collapsed on the wet sand just beyond the waterline. The immediate danger of drowning had passed, but Michael knew he wasn't safe yet. The wound on his leg continued to bleed profusely, and without treatment, he faced the very real possibility of bleeding out on this deserted quay. With trembling hands, he removed his belt and fashioned a makeshift tourniquet above the injury, pulling it tight enough to slow the blood flow without completely cutting circulation. Using his remaining strength, he dragged himself further up the beach to where a cluster of sea grape trees provided some shelter. The pain had settled into a throbbing agony that accompanied each heartbeat. Michael retrieved his phone from its waterproof case, saying a silent prayer as he pressed the power button. The screen illuminated. The case had done its job. There was no cellular service as expected, but the phone's GPS still functioned. He activated its emergency beacon feature, which would transmit his location to search and rescue services. Whether they would respond in time remained uncertain. As shock began to set in, Michael focused on controlling his breathing and staying conscious. He tore strips from his shirt to create a crude pressure bandage, securing it over the worst of the lacerations. The damage was extensive. The shark's teeth had torn through muscle and possibly nicked an artery, judging by the pulsating nature of the bleeding. Time passed in a haze of pain and intermittent lucidity. Michael alternated between tightening and loosening the tourniquet, knowing that prolonged restriction of blood flow could lead to tissue death, but aware that bleeding remained his most immediate threat. He drank sparingly from his water bottle, recognizing the importance of staying hydrated as his body struggled to compensate for blood loss. From his position under the sea grape trees, he had a clear view of the channel he had attempted to cross. Twice he spotted fins cutting through the surface. Whether the same shark or others attracted by the blood, he couldn't tell. The sight reinforced the impossibility of returning to the water, even if he'd had the strength to try. The storm had moved eastward, leaving behind scattered clouds and occasional sunlight that did little to warm his increasingly chilled body. Another symptom of blood loss that Michael recognized with clinical detachment. He checked his watch. Nearly 3 hours had passed since the attack. The Coast Guard would be searching for his boat, but without his EPIRB transmitting from the vessel, they might be looking in the wrong area entirely. As the afternoon waned, Michael's condition deteriorated. The combination of shock, blood loss and dehydration left him drifting in and out of consciousness. During one lucid period, he heard the distant thrum of an engine. Summoning his remaining strength, he reached into his dry bag and retrieved the small emergency whistle attached to his marina pass. The sharp, piercing sound carried across the water as he blew with all the force his weakened state allowed. Minutes passed with no response, and despair began to creep in alongside the pain and cold. Then the engine noise grew louder, approaching rather than receding. A small Coast Guard response boat appeared around the eastern end of the quay, moving slowly as personnel aboard scanned the shoreline. Michael blew the whistle again and waved his arms weakly. A crew member spotted him, pointing in his direction as the boat changed course toward the beach. The rescue itself came as a blur of activity and voices. Coast Guard medical personnel stabilized his leg, established an IV line to combat shock, and transferred him to the vessel on a backboard. One of the rescuers, a young woman with efficient movements and calm eyes visible above her surgical mask, provided a running commentary of their actions, more to keep him conscious than to inform. "You've lost a significant amount of blood, sir, but we've got the bleeding under control. We're taking you directly to Mariners Hospital in Tavernier. They're prepping for emergency surgery. Can you tell me your name?" "Michael Reeves," he managed, his voice a raspy whisper. "Good, Michael, stay with us. Can you tell me what happened?" Through parched lips he recounted the engine failure, the decision to swim, and the shark attack. The medic nodded, continuing her assessment while relaying information to the hospital via radio. The journey to the mainland passed in a fog of pain medications and the rhythmic bouncing of the rescue boat over waves. By the time they docked at the emergency medical slip near the hospital, Michael's consciousness had narrowed to a pinpoint of awareness, surrounded by encroaching darkness. The transfer from boat to ambulance and into the emergency department unfolded in disconnected fragments. Bright lights, urgent voices, the cold flow of additional fluids entering his veins. A surgeon appeared briefly in his field of vision, examining the wound and issuing rapid instructions to the team surrounding the gurney. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Dr. Patel. You've sustained a significant shark bite with extensive tissue damage and vascular compromise. We need to take you into surgery immediately to repair the arterial damage and clean the wound. Do you understand?" Michael managed a weak nod. "Is there anyone we should contact for you?" He provided his sister's phone number in Tampa before the medications pulled him under, delivering him into merciful unconsciousness. When Michael awoke, the muted beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell of hospital surroundings oriented him before he opened his eyes. The room was dimly lit, suggesting nighttime, and the dull throb in his leg had replaced the searing pain from earlier. A nurse noticed his stirring and approached the bedside. "Welcome back, Mr. Reeves. You're in the ICU at Mariners Hospital. The surgery went well, but you had us worried for a while with the blood loss. How are you feeling?" "Thirsty," he croaked, his throat raw from the intubation during surgery. She offered ice chips rather than water, explaining that his system needed to readjust gradually. As he became more alert, she summarized his condition. The shark had severed his posterior tibial artery and caused extensive damage to his gastrocnemius and soleus muscles. The surgical team had repaired the artery, debrided the wound of damaged tissue, and closed what they could, though a second surgery would likely be necessary. "You were lucky in some ways," she added. "No major nerve damage was detected, and the orthopedic surgeon believes you should regain significant function with proper rehabilitation. But it's going to be a long recovery." Michael absorbed this information with a detached sense of relief. Alive was better than the alternative, even if the path forward looked challenging. Later that morning, Dr. Patel arrived with a more detailed assessment. The surgeon's expression was serious but not grim as he examined the bandaged leg and checked Michael's vital signs. "The primary concern now is infection," he explained. "Shark bites introduce numerous bacteria into the wound. We've started you on broad-spectrum antibiotics, but we'll need to monitor the site carefully over the next few days." Michael nodded, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind since consciousness returned. "Will I walk normally again?" Dr. Patel's expression softened slightly. "With commitment to physical therapy and barring complications, yes, though there may be some permanent limitation in range of motion. The damage to your calf muscles was substantial, but the human body has remarkable recuperative abilities." A marine biologist from the University of Miami arrived that afternoon, accompanied by a Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation officer. They interviewed Michael about the encounter, documenting details about the shark's size, behavior, and the specific location of the attack. "Based on your description, it was almost certainly a bull shark," the biologist Dr. Rivera confirmed. "They're common in that area, especially in channels between islands where tidal flow concentrates prey species. Your account of its behavior, the circling, the investigatory approach, and then the sudden attack from below, is consistent with documented bull shark predation patterns." The wildlife officer, Deputy Watson, added his perspective. "We don't classify these incidents as attacks in our official reports. The shark was behaving according to its natural instincts in its environment. But regardless of terminology, we document these encounters to establish patterns and better inform public safety measures." Michael understood the distinction, but found it somewhat academic, given the 64 stitches currently holding his leg together. Still, he provided as much detail as he could recall, hoping the information might help prevent similar incidents in the future. His sister Amanda arrived from Tampa the following day, her normally composed demeanor cracking as she saw him in the hospital bed. After the initial emotional reunion, her practical nature emerged as she helped coordinate with insurance. Arranged for his boat's recovery. It had been found drifting and towed to the marina, and organized what would be needed for his eventual discharge and rehabilitation. "You could have died, Mike," she said quietly during a lull in these activities, "swimming across that channel alone. What were you thinking?" "That I knew those waters," he replied. "That I've swum farther in rougher conditions. That the alternative was drifting out to sea in a disabled boat during a storm." She didn't press the point, recognizing the uselessness of retrospective criticism. Instead, she focused on the future, researching physical therapists specializing in marine trauma recovery and arranging for modifications to his ground floor apartment to accommodate limited mobility during healing. News of the incident spread quickly through the Keys' close-knit maritime community. Several local captains visited, bringing magazines, food that circumvented hospital dietary restrictions, and stories of their own close encounters with the ocean's predators. Jerry from the marina arrived with Michael's wallet and keys retrieved from the boat, along with an offer to help with maintenance while he recovered. "Boat's fine, by the way," Jerry reported. "Engine just had water in the fuel line from that. Leak in your tank cap. Been meaning to tell you to replace that gasket. Nothing major damaged in the drifting. She'll be ready when you are." The local newspaper sent a reporter who seemed disappointed that Michael didn't portray the shark as a malevolent monster or himself as a heroic survivor against impossible odds. His matter-of-fact account, acknowledging his own poor decision-making and the shark's predictable behavior, made for less sensational copy, but earned respect from the marine conservation community. 5 days after the surgery, Dr. Patel deemed Michael stable enough for discharge, though with strict instructions for wound care, medication adherence, and absolute prohibition against getting the surgical site wet. Amanda had arranged for him to stay with her in Tampa for the initial recovery period, where she could help with daily tasks and transportation to medical appointments. The journey to Tampa was uncomfortable, despite the prescription pain medications and the careful driving. Every bump in the road sent jolts of pain through Michael's leg, a constant reminder of how extensive the damage had been. Amanda had converted her home office into a temporary bedroom on the first floor, equipped with a hospital bed rented from a medical supply company and a borrowed wheelchair for longer distances. The first week at Amanda's passed in a haze of pain management, sleep disrupted by nightmares of being underwater and unable to surface, and the beginning of what would be months of physical therapy. The initial exercises were maddeningly simple: ankle rotations, gentle knee bends, isometric contractions, but even these caused pain that required gritted teeth to endure. Gradually, a routine developed. Mornings began with medication and wound care, followed by the increasingly complex exercises prescribed by the physical therapist who visited 3 times weekly. Afternoons were spent elevating the leg, while catching up on reading or watching documentaries, anything to combat the creeping sense of isolation and dependence that threatened his usually independent spirit. Amanda returned to her accounting job after the first week, having arranged her schedule to allow working from home 3 days a week. On the days she went to the office, neighbors checked in or brought meals, creating a support network that Michael appreciated, even as he chafed at needing it. The nightmares evolved but didn't disappear. In the most recurring version, he would be swimming toward shore, the island clearly visible, when the water around him would suddenly darken. Unlike reality, in these dreams, he never saw the shark, only felt the inexorable pull downward as unseen forces dragged him into the depths. He would wake gasping, the sheets tangled around his legs, the surgical scar throbbing in sympathetic memory. 3 weeks after the attack, Michael returned to the Keys for a follow-up appointment with Dr. Patel. The surgeon seemed pleased with the healing progress, noting that the risk of infection had significantly decreased and that the repaired artery was functioning well. "You've been diligent with your exercises," Dr. Patel observed as he tested the range of motion in Michael's ankle and knee. "That's going to pay dividends in your long-term recovery." During the same visit, Michael met with a specialist in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, a treatment that could potentially accelerate healing of the damaged tissues. The procedure involved breathing pure oxygen in a pressurized chamber, increasing oxygen saturation in the bloodstream and promoting faster repair of injured areas. Insurance would cover a portion of the treatments, and Michael decided the out-of-pocket expense was worthwhile if it meant a quicker return to normal function. While in the Keys, he made a point of visiting the marina. The familiar sights and smells, salt-weathered wood, diesel fuel, fish being cleaned at the stations, stirred a complex mix of emotions. His boat sat in its slip, covered and maintained, as Jerry had promised, waiting for a return that seemed simultaneously imminent and impossibly distant. Several of the charter captains were at the dock, preparing for afternoon trips or returning from morning excursions. They greeted Michael with the gruff camaraderie characteristic of the profession, asking pointed questions about his recovery while avoiding any hint of pity. "Got a group of tourists yesterday who wouldn't shut up about shark attacks after they heard about yours," Captain Ross told him, as they sat in the shade of the marina office. "Had to give them the whole safety lecture. More likely to be killed by a coconut falling on your head than a shark, all that stuff. Didn't stop them from jumping every time a dolphin surfaced near the boat." Michael smiled, appreciating the normalcy of the conversation. "Tell them the truth next time. Guy was stupid enough to swim across a channel during feeding time. Nothing mysterious about it." The self-deprecation felt right, a way of acknowledging his role in what had happened without diminishing the impact it had on his life. The other captains nodded in understanding. They all knew the fine line between respecting the ocean and fearing it, between confidence and recklessness. Before leaving the marina, Michael stood at the end of the dock, looking out over the water where his ordeal had begun. The channel appeared peaceful in the afternoon light, giving no indication of the dangers it could harbor. A brown pelican dove for fish nearby, emerging with a successful catch. Life in this ecosystem continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas that occasionally intersected with it. That evening, he visited Coral Key, hiring a water taxi to take him to the beach where he had dragged himself ashore. The driver, an older man named Cal, who had been running his taxi service for decades, knew the story and maintained a respectful silence during the journey, understanding the pilgrimage's significance without needing explanation. The Key looked different from the water, Smaller, more vulnerable than it had appeared as a salvation during his desperate swim, Cal anchored offshore, offering to row Michael to the beach in the dinghy, but he declined. Seeing it was enough, he didn't need to feel the sand under his feet again to process what had happened there. The weeks following his return to Amanda's home in Tampa brought steady improvement. The hyperbaric treatments seemed to accelerate healing, and by the 2-month mark, Michael had progressed from wheelchair to walker to cane. The surgical scar, a jagged crescent wrapping around his calf, remained angry and red, but the surrounding tissue had begun to regain its normal color and texture. Throughout this period, Michael researched shark attacks with academic intensity, reading scientific papers on bull shark behavior, attack statistics, and survival accounts. The information served as both therapy and education, helping him contextualize his experience within the broader reality of shark-human interactions. One evening, as he shared his findings with Amanda over dinner, she interrupted his recitation of statistics with a pointed question. Does knowing all this make it easier to think about going back in the water? The question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on recovery, on the physical aspects of healing, that he hadn't fully confronted the psychological barrier that had formed around the idea of returning to the ocean. I don't know, he admitted finally. Logically, I understand the statistical insignificance of what happened to me. Thousands of people enter that water every day without incident, but logic doesn't seem to have much influence over how my heart rate spikes when I even think about submerging myself again. Amanda nodded, understanding without judgment. No rush to figure it out. Some things take longer to heal than muscle and skin. By the 3-month mark, Michael had regained enough independence to return to his apartment in the Keys. Amanda helped with the transition, stocking his refrigerator and arranging for continued physical therapy at a local rehabilitation center. His mobility had improved significantly, though he still used a cane for longer distances and experienced stiffness and pain after periods of activity. The return home represented both a victory and a new challenge. Being back in his own space restored a sense of normalcy and self-sufficiency that hospital rooms and his sister's guest bed couldn't provide. But it also meant confronting daily reminders of his pre-attack life, the fishing gear stored in his hall closet, the wetsuit hanging in the laundry room, the framed photographs of past successful expeditions decorating his walls. His first visit to the physical therapist in Key Largo, Dr. Esther Williams, who good-naturedly tolerated endless jokes about her name, brought a more optimistic prognosis than he had dared hope for. After a thorough assessment of his strength, range of motion, and gait, she outlined a recovery timeline that could potentially have him back on a boat by the 6-month mark. The muscle damage was extensive, she explained, manipulating his ankle through various positions. But the surgical repair was excellent, and you've clearly been disciplined about your home exercises. There's significant scar tissue formation, which we'll need to address, but I think we can expect 85–90% functional recovery with consistent work. The rehabilitation process intensified under Dr. Williams' guidance. Sessions 3 times weekly incorporated not just strength and flexibility exercises, but also water therapy in the center's heated pool, a controlled reintroduction to the aquatic environment that initially triggered anxiety attacks Michael had to work through with measured breathing and mental grounding techniques. Between therapy appointments, he began rebuilding his life in incremental steps. Financial concerns loomed. His savings had dwindled during the months without income, and medical bills continued to arrive despite insurance coverage. The charter company where he occasionally guided offered administrative work until he was cleared for on-water duties, a temporary solution that provided some financial stability while keeping him connected to the maritime community. 4 months after the attack, Michael was invited to speak at a marine conservation event at the local high school. The organizer, a biology teacher who had followed his story in the local paper, hoped his first-hand account would help students understand both the realities of shark behavior and the importance of respecting marine ecosystems. Standing before a classroom of teenagers, Michael found an unexpected catharsis in sharing his experience without sensationalism or embellishment. He emphasized the contextual factors, his decision to swim across the channel, the post-storm, conditions that likely affected water clarity and fish activity, the natural feeding behaviors of bull sharks in that environment, while acknowledging the profound impact the encounter had on his life. "The ocean isn't a swimming pool," he told the attentive students. "It's a wilderness environment with its own rules and inhabitants that deserve our respect. The shark that bit me wasn't being malicious. It was being a shark in shark territory. My presence there, especially swimming alone in conditions where visibility was poor, created a situation where natural predatory instincts came into play." The students' questions ranged from the practical, "How deep was the bite?" to the philosophical, "Do you hate sharks now?" Michael answered honestly, showing the healing scar when asked, and explaining that his feelings toward sharks had evolved into a complicated respect rather than fear or hatred. "The shark was doing what millions of years of evolution designed it to do," he concluded. "I was the anomaly in that environment, not it. Understanding that has been an important part of processing what happened." The presentation's success led to similar speaking engagements at other schools and community organizations. These opportunities provided not just supplemental income, but also a platform for advocating responsible ocean use and accurate shark education, turning his traumatic experience into something constructive rather than merely something to overcome. 5 months post-attack, Michael's physical recovery had progressed to the point where Dr. Williams cleared him for light maritime activities, a deliberately vague prescription that acknowledged his improving condition while urging continued caution. The muscles in his affected leg had regained significant strength, though still noticeably less defined than those in his uninjured leg. His gait had improved from a pronounced limp to a slight unevenness that was apparent only to those looking for it. The psychological recovery remained more complicated. Michael had begun working with a therapist specializing in trauma, addressing not just the shark encounter itself, but the broader implications it carried for his identity and future. Having built much of his adult life around his relationship with the ocean, the newly complicated nature of that relationship required ongoing recalibration. His first attempt to return to the water came on a calm morning 6 months to the day after the attack. Jerry and 2 other friends from the marina accompanied him, providing both moral support and practical safety. They took Jerry's pontoon boat, a stable platform with easy water access, to a sheltered cove where Michael had often snorkeled before the incident. Sitting on the boat's dive platform, legs dangling above the crystal-clear water, Michael felt his heart racing despite the obviously safe conditions. Jerry sat beside him, uncharacteristically patient and quiet, waiting without pressure. "Take your time, brother," he said simply. "Water's not going anywhere." After 20 minutes of internal struggle, Michael eased himself into the water, keeping one hand firmly on the platform. The familiar buoyancy felt simultaneously comforting and threatening, a contradiction he hadn't anticipated. He stayed in the water for only 5 minutes that first day, never letting go of the boat, but considered even that limited re-entry a significant victory. Subsequent water encounters became gradually longer and more independent. He established a systematic desensitization program with his therapist's guidance, progressing from shallow, clear waters with companions to increasingly challenging conditions. Each successful experience helped recalibrate his risk assessment capabilities, distinguishing between reasonable caution and trauma-induced fear responses. 7 months after the attack, Michael piloted his own boat for the first time since the incident. With the experienced swimmer friend aboard as a precaution, he took the Boston Whaler on a short circuit of the bay, staying within sight of the marina. The engine that had failed him ran flawlessly, having been thoroughly serviced and tested by a mechanic during his recovery. The simple act of steering his vessel, feeling the familiar vibration of the hull planing across the water, reconnected him with the sense of freedom and competence that had drawn him to this life in the first place. He didn't venture near Coral Key or the Channel, where the attack had occurred. That test would come later, but the excursion represented a significant milestone nonetheless. When the first anniversary of the attack approached, Michael decided to face the specific location where it had happened. He invited Dr. Rivera, the marine biologist who had interviewed him in the hospital, to accompany him, wanting both the emotional support and the scientific perspective she could provide. They took his boat on a clear morning, conditions starkly different from the stormy day of the attack. As they approached the channel between the mainland and Coral Key, Michael felt his pulse quicken, his palms dampen with sweat despite the mild temperature. Dr. Rivera noticed his tension but maintained a conversational tone, discussing the ecological factors that made this area particularly attractive to bull sharks. The tidal exchange through this channel concentrates bait fish, she explained, pointing to schools of small fish visible in the clear water. Combine that with the deeper drop-off on the seaward side, and you've created an ideal hunting ground. Sharks are extraordinarily efficient at identifying and exploiting these productive environments. Michael nodded, appreciating the clinical framing that helped distance him from the emotional weight of the location. They anchored approximately where his engine had failed a year earlier, and he scanned the water, now peaceful and inviting under the morning sun, trying to reconcile it with the churning, threatening environment of his memory. "Want to go in?" Dr. Rivera asked after they had been stationary for nearly half an hour. The question wasn't a challenge, but an honest inquiry. Michael considered it seriously, weighing his readiness against the potential therapeutic value. Finally, he shook his head. "Not today. Being here is enough for now." She nodded in understanding. "The sharks are still here, you know. Probably several within a few hundred yards of us right now. They're just doing shark things, looking for food, conserving energy, following instinctual patterns that have served their species for millions of years." "I know," Michael replied. "That's part of why I respect them more now, not less. They're perfectly adapted to their role in this ecosystem. I was the one out of place that day, not them." As they prepared to return to the marina, Michael spotted a dorsal fin cutting through the water about 50 yards from the boat. A bull shark, from the shape and color, though smaller than the one that had attacked him. His reaction surprised him. Not panic or revulsion, but a quiet acknowledgement of the creature's presence and right to be there. The shark continued on its path, showing no interest in the boat or its occupants, eventually disappearing into deeper water. The sighting provided an unexpected sense of closure. The sharks were still here, as they had been before his encounter, and would be long after. His relationship with their environment had been permanently altered, marked literally on his body with the crescent scar that would never fully fade. But witnessing this peaceful coexistence, human and shark occupying the same waters without conflict, reinforced what he had come to believe throughout his recovery. The attack had been an anomaly, a rare convergence of circumstances, rather than an inevitable outcome of sharing the ocean. Over the months that followed, Michael gradually resumed most of his pre-attack activities, though with modifications that acknowledged both his physical limitations and heightened awareness of risk. He returned to occasional guiding work with the charter company, finding that sharing his knowledge and respect for the marine environment with tourists brought satisfaction that balanced the lower physical demands compared to his previous solo expeditions. His speaking engagements expanded beyond local schools to include conservation organizations, fishing clubs, and safety training programs for maritime professionals. The scar on his leg served as a powerful visual aid during these talks, a reminder of the real consequences that could result from poor decisions in the marine environment, but also of the resilience of both human bodies and spirits. 2 years after the attack, Michael was approached by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission about participating in a pilot program for shark encounter education. The initiative aimed to provide accurate information about shark behavior, risk factors, and safety protocols for coastal communities, countering both the sensationalized portrayals in media and the dismissive attitudes that sometimes led to unnecessary risks. His role would combine his first-hand experience with the knowledge he had accumulated during his recovery and subsequent research. The position offered the stability of government employment while keeping him connected to the waters and communities he considered home. After careful consideration, he accepted. In his new capacity, Michael worked with marine biologists, including Dr. Rivera, to develop educational materials that presented sharks not as mindless killing machines or harmless swimming companions, but as complex predators deserving respect and appropriate caution. He contributed to the creation of risk assessment tools for beach management authorities and training programs for first responders dealing with marine injuries. The work took him to coastal communities throughout Florida, where he met others who had survived shark encounters and integrated their experiences into the program's approach. These connections formed a unique support network, people who understood the specific trauma and recovery process that conventional support groups couldn't fully address. On a personal level, Michael's relationship with the ocean continued to evolve. He swam regularly, though rarely alone and never in the specific channel where the attack had occurred. He maintained his boat and fishing skills, finding peace in the familiar rhythms of maritime life, even as certain precautions became permanent features of his approach to the water. The nightmares diminished in frequency, but never disappeared entirely. On occasional nights, especially after days spent discussing his experience or viewing new footage of bull sharks for educational materials, he would wake in the darkness, heart pounding from the remembered sensation of being pulled underwater. These episodes became manageable through grounding techniques his therapist had taught him, and he came to view them as his mind's way of reinforcing the respectful caution that now characterized his relationship with the sea. 3 years after the attack, Michael returned to Coral Key alone for the first time. The decision wasn't impulsive but carefully considered, a personal milestone he had been working toward through incremental exposure and psychological preparation. He anchored his boat offshore and swam to the beach where he had dragged himself. After the attack, experiencing a complex mix of vulnerability, accomplishment, and gratitude as his feet touched the sand. Sitting on the beach, looking out over the channel that had nearly claimed his life, Michael reflected on the journey from victim to survivor to educator. The shark that had altered his life path was likely still patrolling these waters, continuing its ancient behaviors, unaware of the human narrative in which it had played a pivotal role. That thought no longer filled him with dread, but with a sense of perspective. His story was just one brief intersection between two very different worlds. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Michael returned to his boat, swimming with strong, confident strokes through the same waters that had once been the setting for his most terrifying experience. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something manageable, incorporated into a broader understanding of his place in the natural world. Somewhere beneath the surface, unseen but undeniably present, sharks continued their endless patrol of these coastal waters. Michael started his engine and turned toward home, carrying with him both the physical reminder of their encounter etched into his leg and the deeper marks it had left on his understanding of risk, respect, and resilience in the face of nature's indifferent power. The ocean stretched around him, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, a reality he had come to accept not despite his experience, but because of it.